Hello and good evening. It's really great to see everyone here. Welcome. My name is David Madden. I'm an associate professor of sociology here at LSE and director of the Cities program. And I'm very happy to be able to serve as chair for tonight's lecture by Professor Mona Fawaz. I'm also one of the editors of the journal City, Analysis of Urban Change Theory Action. In that capacity, I want to welcome you all to tonight's lecture as well. This is a special annual City lecture. And I just want to start off by saying that I feel especially grateful for opportunities to reflect critically on how our world works in times of acute crisis. I mean, I think we all agree that these days the news cycles come fast and almost entirely bleak. So it's even more vital that we have a chance to hear from and speak with critical thinkers who are trying to make sense of the world. This lecture is intended as a sort of real-time opportunity to demonstrate the sort of critical urban scholarship that we at City try to foster as a journal and as an extended community of critical researchers. City, as a journal, was created in 1996 by our founding editor, Bob Catterall, who sadly passed away on 30th July 2025. And our forthcoming editorial in the next upcoming issue is going to feature a number of reflections on his work and his legacy in the field. Bob, and it would be unnatural to refer to him as Catterall, everyone just call him Bob. Bob began the first issue of City with the following questions. He said, what is a city in the late 20th century? And just as important a question, what could and should it be, when, where, how? So from the first sentences of the journal's existence, it signaled that its agenda was vast. It was trying to understand urbanity and urbanization in all of its multidimensional complexity. And it also signaled that it was not only concerned with describing the empirical profile of contemporary cities, important as that is, but also seeking to understand the potential for urbanization to be organized otherwise, to produce a different kind of city and society. So concerned also with rethinking the urban, trying to imagine what it could be otherwise. I think we are now, 30 years later, almost 30 years later, at a time when it seems kind of impossible and maybe even a little pointless to try to imagine a city that is otherwise and that is an urbanization that is organized differently. But in the pages of our journal, we really try to keep this critical spirit alive. And maybe today, in fact, spurred by Professor Fawaz's talk, we can talk a bit more about what it means to do critical urban scholarship and critical urban scholarship in moments of such crisis. Over the years, we've published groundbreaking articles on urban restructuring, social movements, gentrification, displacement, neoliberalism, the right to the city, financialization, austerity, urban ecology, the climate crisis, and most of the other major issues that urban life has confronted, produced, and resisted. Some of the newest articles on our website explore the remaking of home in Buenos Aires, charitable organizations as city makers in Kuwait, and the political economy of solidarity with asylum seekers in New York City. So it's a very exciting journal. I feel very lucky to be able to be a part of it. I hope you all will read it, submit your work to it as well. Tonight's lecture promises to further develop our journal's critical mission through a discussion of the challenges of participatory urban planning in our authoritarian moment. And it promises to shed light on major issues in Beirut, where this empirical material is located, as well as elsewhere. So let me introduce tonight's speakers. The City lecture will be delivered by Professor Mona Fawaz, who is Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and Coordinator of the Graduate Programs in Urban Planning and Design at the American University of Beirut. Professor Fawaz works on an intimidatingly large number of areas, including urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, property and space, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. She has authored over 40 scholarly articles, book sections, and reports in Arabic, French, and English. She is an editor of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, one of the leading critical urban studies journals. And she's also co-founder and research director of the Beirut Urban Lab, a groundbreaking interdisciplinary research center at AUB that seeks to build, in its words, an ecosystem of change empowered by critical inquiry and engaged research, driven by committed urban citizens and collectives aspiring to just, inclusive, and viable cities. Following Mona's lecture, we will hear a response from our discussant, Professor Catalina Ortiz. She is Professor of Critical Urban Pedagogy at the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment at University College London. In her work, Professor Ortiz uses decolonial and critical urban theory and a wide variety of innovative methods in order to study the politics of urban space towards the goal of fostering more just cities and recognizing multiple urban knowledges. Among other roles, she is an editor at the journal Urban Studies and a corresponding editor at International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. Professor Ortiz is also director of the UCL Urban Laboratory, which is, in its words, a world-leading cross-disciplinary center promoting critical, creative, and collaborative inquiry into urban problems. So we've got two major urban labs represented here. It's very exciting, and as well as the heads of two major urban labs, we just have two of the world's leading urban scholars. So I think it's going to be a very exciting event. Following presentations from our main speaker and discussant, we'll have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions or offer thoughts in response. Following that, everyone is invited to a reception right outside in the lobby. So I want to thank you once more for coming tonight, and I'm excited to pass the floor to Professor Mona Fawaz.
I'm just going to put my timer on so I don't go on forever. So thank you so much, David, for this very, very generous and intimidating introduction. Thank you also for the invite for City. I'm really honored to be delivering this lecture and grateful for the invitation. I also want to thank Catalina, who is doing the role of discussant for the second time for me, and look forward to discussing your own work, of which I'm a great fan. I'm also a big fan of City, so really it is meaningful for me to give this lecture. Before I start talking about the topic, you've guessed I'm coming from Beirut, and so I need to tell you a couple of words about what is happening and how it feels to be giving this presentation. I took the plane on Saturday morning thinking I will have 2 quiet days in my hotel to prepare and rehearse and present before I give the lecture. And I landed in London only to hear that the war had started and Iran had been attacked. And it was only a matter of days before it will spread to Lebanon, which it has today. So today, only 55 people were killed in Lebanon, and the total for 2 days in Tehran, in Iran, is 555. So I wrote that presentation checking on the Beirut International Airport and making sure that Middle East Airline was still flying, which it still is, every 20 minutes, but also answering my phone, my WhatsApp, trying to help people coming from the south that I know found a place to stay in Beirut, learning that a former colleague of us was killed last night in the southern suburbs of Beirut, a civilian who worked as a researcher at the university. And every time this violence erupts in the world, I think it poses really critical questions about what it means to be a scholar from the south. And we've seen this southern turn in the last years really take a big space, but a space of posturing, sadly. And so I want you to also know that conducting research in the global south is actually and essentially trying to make sense and pretend that you're relevant when things that are much bigger than you, that are actually coming from the global north, are actually shaping a lot of your life. And many times over the past 3 days, I thought about packing my suitcase and saying, I really don't have anything to say. And how can I talk to you about planning and hope and making better cities and reinvigorating local political processes when we are in the background of a genocide and a war that is unfolding? But as my friend and colleague, Azadeh, reminded me last night, convincing me that no, I should do it, that the work of shaping spaces for a different collective, whether it's in Tehran, Beirut, Ramallah, Khan Yunis, or other cities today under fire, may be a seed that will one day make a difference. Never has the urgency to have a meaningful, different kind of scholarship and practice and a different kind of university been felt more. I don't think that my talk today will make a big change, but hopefully it's a tiny step in this direction, and I'm going to try to do that. With this, I will pretend that we can move now to Beirut, where, as you can see on the top view, what I call the half square, which is literally half an urban square, stands eloquently as a reflection of our fractured public in today's Beirut and Lebanon. So the implementation of this small public square has now been halted for over 2 years, since one of Beirut's all-powerful authorities, actually its 8 bishops combined, met on July 10, 2023, to express opposition to the implementation of this public square, despite the fact that the project had been approved by the municipal council, by elected local representatives, but also by the local representative on the street, the Mukhtar, vetted by community members in several deliberative meetings, and it had received a lot of public endorsement, including a public letter from 250 of the most respected urban designers and planners working in Lebanon. The design of the square constituted a small local adaptation of a larger vision of what we imagine to be one day a greener city, Beirut, where we seek to improve neighborhoods' walkability, increase shared open spaces, in a city notorious for its dearth of open public spaces. So not many of you are planners here. I'm really privileged to have a very interdisciplinary crowd. Beirut has about 0.7, 0.8 meters square of public space. In general, as planners, we aim for about 10. So we are less than 1/10 of what we need. And of course, as you can see on these pictures, the streets are dominated by cars, and this is a frequent complaint by all city dwellers, including those who reside in the neighborhood that I'm showing you here. The project proposed a very simple intervention to widen a pre-existing sidewalk as part of broad initiatives of urban recovery that followed the 2020 port blast. It proposed to upgrade a public staircase, which you can see here, but also introduced a few benches and a big tree, hence displacing a few parking spots, narrowing slightly the street, and creating a space for people. In many ways, our design followed and expanded the practice of local store owners who frequently appropriate the sidewalk, and also the way we use streets such as this one, where cars and people mingle easily. The interruption of the project implementation came after months of negotiation, when our small team of dedicated designers and activists, which included researchers at the Beirut Urban Lab, at the American University of Beirut, as well as several colleagues volunteered from the professional sector, who engaged in lengthy deliberations with a few actors who denounced our project, and you see here a protest against the project, as a threat to the city, with a repertoire of vignettes that basically describe the public space, the small, tiny public space, as creating disorder, fear, and chaos. The initial community support to the project soon turned into a divided and divisive reality, and we as planners were eventually accused of introducing an unwanted, top-down, undemocratic intervention. A first reading can dismiss this confrontation as normal. I think we've all become used to public spaces either gentrifying when you're on the left, it's gentrifying and it's shishi middle class obsession, or it's chaos and fear and it's going to bring all the people you don't want. And in a city like Beirut, where about 1 in 5 person is actually a refugee, it's going to bring all those people we don't want to our neighborhood. Starting from the premise that neither of these positions is satisfying, I want in this presentation with my co-author and former student, Maria Rashha, to go beyond this dismissal and scrutinize more closely what happened, drawing lessons for both the possibilities and limitations of planning as a political practice in a context rife with social divisions, rampant neoliberalism, and a rising right-wing populism. Before I tell you the story, let me just think for a minute about what it means to theorize a story like this. So my presentation takes seriously, or our presentation takes seriously the call for reflexive scholarship, situating analysis within our own trajectories as activist planners and designers. We write as two different position practitioners. One of us is an experienced scholar, that's me. I have 30 years of actually trying to engage the public domain in Lebanon. And Maria, who is considerably younger, has for the last 10 years tried to be involved in urban campaigns as well, but also political change. We focus here on this joint initiative, a project that is informed by our respective earlier engagements through which each of us has come to grapple with both the possibilities but also the limits of what constitutes urban activism. Our account is therefore not external to the field we describe, it emerges from it. Elaborating who we are in is a methodological and political decision. Given our position within a university, I think I have a picture, so that's kind of the space that we work in, we are keen to treat knowledge production itself as a situated intervention into ongoing political struggles. Thus, we take seriously the urgency of moving beyond critique, understood narrowly as the exposure of failure. It does not mean ignoring the fact that many things do not work. In fact, the story I'm about to tell you is, to a large extent, a story of failure. However, we refuse to let critique exhaust the horizon of our scholarly responsibility. As colleagues have argued, we need to expand the repertoire of critical urban studies. There's a need to develop empirically nuanced accounts of how urban public spaces are remade and reconfigured, with an eye towards identifying potential points of leverage to configure better and more democratic forms in which we can live. I can think of Simon and Peters, that many of our colleagues have hence overemphasized critique in urban studies and called for more perspective and imaginative registers of inquiry. Our stance is also informed by a broader rethinking of critique itself. In his well-known reflection of the limits of critique, Latour argued that critical practice has too often equated rigor with debunking. So we're constantly unmasking hidden structures, exposing ideological mystification, revealing constructiveness of social arrangements. And of course, this work is indispensable. I am not saying we can do without. However, Latour suggests also that critique becomes politically exhausting when it stops at dismantling and offers no account of how words might be reassembled. Therefore, critique should be coupled with composition, from showing why things are fragile or false to asking how they might be made durable, inhabitable, and shared. Read together, these points suggest that analysis is always already implicated in the shaping of political horizons. If our analysis stops at the disruption of public rule or the failure of urban governance, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead, it needs to lead to propositional work that is not formulated as a departure from critical scholarship, but in continuation in other means. Accordingly, our research does not separate critical thinking from interventionist practice. And I want you to think of this intervention as actually research. It understands scholarly inquiry as both diagnostic and generative, attentive to break down an injustice, yet equally committed to identifying and enacting opening within them. And here I'm really thinking with Beth Ferry. The task is not to choose between critique and engagement, but to hold them together as mutually constitutive dimensions of a reflexive, politically situated urban scholarship. So what does it mean to politicize planning? I'm showing you here a picture of Beirut downtown in the height of the protests back in 2019, when many of us, somewhere behind this fence, were trying to actually invade the parliament. The aim of the presentation is twofold. Empirically, we aim to tell the story of negotiations with which we engaged over the course of a few months to reshape the post-disaster recovery process in Beirut's post-blast. Conceptually, I also want to reflect and report on the possibilities open to use planning as a way to repoliticize the city. So what do we mean by planning, if we want to use planning to repoliticize the city? We define urban planning as a collective and situated practice through which societies organize the material conditions of their coexistence. How are we going to live together? What spaces will we inhabit together? What streets will we use? What infrastructures will we rely on? What neighborhoods will we claim as home? It is the field through which shared territories are shaped and reshaped, and where urban future possibilities are assembled. So planning historically, as you all know, is oriented towards the common good, and it has for a very long time sort of put forward that notion of a public interest, which was conceptualized as a neutral practice, a very professional practice. But I think we're way past that. For the last 30 years, colleagues have critiqued this to the point that now we openly question, at least in academia, what's the public, who's the state, what's the community, who anyway wants to live with each other, who do our institutions represent. We've rehearsed this. We've also rehearsed the fact that planning is rife with power relations that we don't see, and that it often reproduces those power relations. We're aware of this. We've also seen this sort of theorized in two interesting directions. One of them, which is the dark side of planning, sort of tries to show how bad planning has been, even when it claimed to be good, and has really denounced projects that were widely celebrated. The other has articulated strategies to restore a balance of power. So early traditions of advocacy planning, they tried to do that. And more recently, we've seen with Flip, Jürgen, other attempts to unravel the ABCs of power. These traditions are useful, but they don't tell us, so what? If I unravel power, will there be a deliberative meeting where we will then discuss and get to a conclusion? If it does, tell me how to do it for the Middle East. You just have to open the news and see that it doesn't work. Instead, what I'm trying to prove, or what I'm trying to make happen with colleagues at the Urban Lab, mostly younger colleagues who want to see a better world, is to think through planning's tools, actually, as a way of opening a political space. So we approach planning as a terrain of the political, and political meaning confrontational, but also imaginative. A space where collective life is debated, not only in institutions, actually really rarely in institutions, but through spatial interventions and design propositions. We appeal to the tools of planning, its repertoire of professional things, to engage in deeply political discussions of how do we want to live together. We draft proposals for public squares, for open beaches, we rethink circulation patterns, we advocate things, but we convene participatory meetings where we invite the municipality, and we sort of do all sorts of prefigurative exercises in which we attempt to engage a local conversation about who do we want to live together. We don't mediate, we don't pretend like we're listening to the community and we're standing by their side. It's a heroic effort that many colleagues in today's co-production are actually doing. It's really heroic, and here I'm getting a little bit ahead of my notes, because we are at a moment where the university is largely discredited, and at least in the United States and in Lebanon, our position as, which are the two contexts I know well, our knowledge, our position as experts is being not only put in question, but actually dismissed, and that basically was the substance of our progressive politics, but today poses very critical questions about then everyone is entitled to their truth, and how do we do it? And we see this all the time in planning. I'll tell you how in this project. So we are not occupying the role of elected decision makers. Instead, we operate within and alongside profoundly dysfunctional publics. And by public, I include both state actors, communities, and other actors that span between them. In Lebanon, the main actors that we work with are basically political groups who were also militias during the Civil War and who act today like right-wing populist actors with a lot of clientelistic networks. And we seek to widen deliberation and prefigure more inclusive and egalitarian forms of urban life. Our engagement is therefore neither detached analysis nor straightforward advocacy. It's an attempt to inhabit planning as a practice through which urban futures are both contested and cautiously reimagined. This is what I call politicizing planning, following a larger trend in critical urban theory that has called for politicizing the city. So you may be familiar with the debate in critical urban theory that has advocated now that had tried to look at insurgencies, particularly in the 2010 decade and the Arab Spring, as a form of choreography of urban political acting. And in the interest of time, I will not flesh out this debate, but that debate has basically put forward the argument that the protests such as this one put forward a choreography of being together and by an aspirational collective that for a period becomes we, becomes us, it becomes this political actor. And the question that is then posed is what happens after the square, right? And this presentation and the work we're doing follows this invitation. So we're positioned at the intersection of critical urban studies, politics, and planning. And we look at the practice of planning as an arena where the political can continue to unfold in the form of a disruption. And this is very counterintuitive for people who work with planning, because planning is often seen as the mode to put order, to structure things, to quell actually dissent. But in a context where discussions of the possible collective is in a public that's fully fractured, where severe social divides but deep distrust in governing institutions is sustained by the fiction of what everyone says, there is no state in Lebanon. Of course, it's not true, but that's what everyone says. In a context like this, the possibility of the common good is not a mode of stating order, but rather a strategy to disrupt the divide and dividing status quo, to, in Mouffe's words, reagonize the public through a prefigurative practice that works both for and through the city. This requires several conceptual moves. I'll just point out one, which is that in images like this, the instinct is to think that it's we, the people, versus the state that is inside and behind the barrier. And I think this divide is actually very dangerous to take for granted, and that instead it is critical to start thinking about the octopus that runs from within the society and is enmeshed with public actors, and that together forms this, in this moment, some sort of one, public that we're trying to counter with another public that's more egalitarian, inclusive, but that includes both pieces of the state and of society, as difficult as they are to separate with each other. Let's land in Beirut. We can. So I'm not sure if you've seen this. This is the famous August 2020 massive explosion of the Beirut port blast, which devastated large swaths of the city. It killed over 200 people and wounded thousands more, with roughly 300,000 residents displaced from their homes. I remind you that Beirut is 1 million residents, so when you say 300,000, that's about a third of the city. And you can see it in, this doesn't want to work anymore. You can see it here. I can show you. This is where the port happened. And this is a mapping we did at the Urban Lab with colleagues at Rice. So you see everything that's in red is actually severely affected. This is ground zero of the explosion. The massive of course, following the blast, massive protests struck the cities, and cities blamed the government for a disaster of yet unprecedented scale. A callous storage, they had stored basically right here a boat that had 1,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, less than 500 meters next to people's homes, and in the hangar, right in the hangar next to it, there was fireworks. So that's the Beirut port blast. The protests that followed the blast formed the culmination of 6 years of social unrest and political mobilization that denounced corruption and questioned the legitimacy of Lebanon's post-Civil War order since 1990, which materialized a global neoliberal turn with a locally sectarian version. The tensions that oppose city dwellers to the state following the blast are reminiscent of other post-disaster moments. You know, this happens often, since we have an expertise in post-disaster. People usually blame public authorities for not standing with them. And this happened in Lebanon every time. In Beirut, public officials could not visit the blighted neighborhoods without being met with anger. People threw bottles, tomatoes at them, they kicked them out. Despite having a World Bank-sponsored $2 million resiliency plan that was finished that very month, the municipality of Beirut did absolutely nothing. About a week after the blast, they started distributing brooms to help the residents clean their homes. This is one of the neighborhoods that was affected, with a lot of volunteers on the first day, sort of picking up the stuff. This is a timeline that Maria prepared of all the events that led to 2020. So we tried to locate all the other protests that had preceded this event to sort of put it in context. Beirut's recovery, however, was delegated to an area of NGOs, local and international NGOs. And you can see here, I think I have a map. Yes. Seems to be, sorry. This was supposed to be colored. I'm sorry. This one is a bad map. So this was supposed to be colored, and every NGO is in a color. And what you would have seen is 44 different NGOs, each of which was fixing a number of homes. And because they had no idea who was fixing what, and there was no coordination, at the Urban Lab, what we started doing is we created an observatory where our base maps, you can see here the base map, we started giving every NGO access to our data set and mapping where they were fixing to help coordinate this. And we tried to create more generally an observatory that allows people to go to the site and figure out what was happening. One of my favorite was the broken glass survey, where we mapped every few months how much glass was still on the floor or broken, because that gave an idea of where repair was happening. And the reason why, and this is a bracket, but the reason why this is interesting is because what you figured out is that those who fixed very fast were not those who had money, but those who were very poor. And the reason is very simple. With the housing crisis, if you were poor, you slept on the glass that evening. You had no luxury to go elsewhere. If you were rich, you waited for the insurance company to reimburse you. And that took a couple of years. So you rented something else, or you bought another apartment, and you negotiated your place. A lot of counterintuitive things happen in context like this. But in the city bankrupt, where electricity is secured through private generators, water brought from private contractors, and waste collection privatized, what remained to be fixed was basically the sum of individual homes and some special interest in the form of heritage protection, which often took the form of evicting tenants who had benefited until then from the extension of their rent control. This was to some a moment of celebration and a populist being together. So you can see here, many people celebrated this. The decision was for city dwellers to take charge of their lives. However, the philanthropic machine is far from an act of collective solidarity. It functions within its logic that has been documented in other contexts, such as Haiti, eloquently. And yet, it functions as yet one more face of the so-called post-political neoliberal apparatus. In this framework, planning is typically denounced to manage and quell conflict, suppress or preemptively close possibilities towards dissent, through bypassing, short-circuiting, and circumventing difficult and contentious questions. So by basically turning the post-disaster recovery into the work of NGOs, about 44 big ones and then many small ones, what happened is basically that the residents of the neighborhood began to look for NGOs to fix their homes. And this basically turned things into a one-to-one negotiation and a competition among the city dwellers for who will attract more NGOs so they can get more benefits. Completely lost in this was basically a discussion of what will happen to the collective space. Is that an opportunity to do something else? But the fact that the government was directly responsible for the blast, that there was anger against it, we saw this as an opportunity to basically say, okay, is there a crack here? Can we create a different public space? Can we intervene differently? So our idea of trying to create a public space, a place of encounter that was more open-ended, came from there. It was here that planning became really interesting, because it followed the protests that you're seeing here, and it tried to say, okay, let's create spaces like this is semi-private, that are open to people, that people can use, against these spaces that people occupied temporarily during the 2019 protest, but that are usually not accessible for daily, regular encounters. And as you can see, that was what we were trying to bring back. Reminiscently, this is one of the highways we were closing during the war, the protest back in 2019. Coming to the reconstruction, to this project as an engaged party, our struggle over the implementation of a public space embodied an attempt to reclaim, through planning, the city as a terrain for spaces of collective being together, where different solidarities could be cultivated. Our conception of the square was in the lineage of decades of involvement in the public domain. We saw in the practice of planning the possibility to mobilize a prefigurative imagination of a different instituted order that would constitute the work of protest that had rocked the city in 2019, as well as the municipal campaign that I was one of the people who started back in 2016, the protests that preceded it. Like protests, planning was therefore an experiment with the choreography of the public, and it posed critical questions about who could be included, how and why. What form of collectives or a common good can it sustain in a context where polarization, owing to the neoliberal order, the actions of right-wing populists and more, had generated a largely dysfunctional collective? I am running out of time, so what I want to do is rehearse, but for some reason, I want to skip some and take you to what was happening and tell you what was happening. So this is the design of the square and the staircase, and the methodology we followed in doing this project was twofold. So while we thought of the intervention as actually the beginning of the research, we kept diaries, we kept media, forensic media coverage, we kept all the information recorded. But then once we were completely evicted from the neighborhood and it became clear that we will not be able to do the project, we went back to the neighborhood and we started actually asking questions. And the questions we asked were twofold. One of them was largely inspired from the literature in Latin America that works on organized crime groups and recognizes the public as largely fractured. So we asked people, who is the public? We basically asked very simple questions, like if someone parks in your place, who do you call on? If someone takes your spot, who do you tell? If someone steals your store, who do you go to? If your neighbor is hitting his wife, who would you call to? Who are, there's an expression in Arabic, I don't know if there's many Arabic speakers, we say Wulad al-Hay, the kids of the neighborhood. So who are the kids of the neighborhood? And then where is Beirut? Where does it start? Where does it stop? And then the second thing we did is we tried to map everyone who tried to do any kind of intervention on public space and to try and see what happened to them. How did they conceive public space and what happened? And so this, what I'm going to tell you now, is basically constructed through these three moments. And these are every one of the public spaces that was done, and we'll come back to it. So the first phase is the phase of design. So the design did not come out of anywhere. It was first part of a plan that many of us had worked on, first professionally and then as activists to stop a highway in the city. So we built on something, on a project that had been supported by activists for at least 6 years when we started, which was to create a green path in the city in a place of a highway that we had stopped implementing. And we considered this as one of the entrances of that project, which we're still working on and fighting for. By doing this, we wanted to intervene directly in the public domain. So we wanted something that was held by the municipality, where the municipality was forced to come and engage the residents. But we also wanted something that was small and modest and that was central in the neighborhood. When we interviewed residents and store owners in the neighborhood first, they were very excited about the project. They wanted it. Particularly elderly people in the neighborhood spoke about being stuck at home, wanting a bench and a place to visit. The local neighborhood elected representative, seeing his basically the people he represents, excited, endorsed the project and went with us to the municipality, where the governor, who doesn't know anything about planning but wants to do something nice, liked the visual and agreed to support the project. It went to the municipal council that basically approved it after months, but they take forever, right? And then you have to get a permit. So between the time we actually filed for the first permit and we got the permit, it was a year and a half. And by that year and a half, things had changed a little bit because the political parties who had been fully discredited at the moment of the blast were now back and had a little bit more power. So when we started the works, for 5 weeks, things looked okay. We closed the road, we started implementation, and we went back and of course we explained what we were doing. We had flyers, we had community meetings on the street. We explained what we were doing. We had some dissent from store owners who knew that they had always thought that the parking slots in front of their stores were theirs, but there were 3 or 4, and most of the residents were excited about the project, so we didn't think far. But then about 3, 4, so this was for us, and this is constructed after sort of the map of power of that first phase that you see here. So this is support for the project against it. As you can see, there was nobody in this first phase that we're calling the courtship. And the governor is the strongest one. This is the influence. So this is most influential and least influential. The locally elected guy, we felt as planners that we were pretty strong here, honestly. We felt like we were influencing, and we felt for a second that we were planners. 3 weeks into the implementation, someone dies in this building, and one of the local, what we call in Lebanon an electoral key, but what they call in Latin America, thank you, Claire, brokers, the people who basically secure electoral vote for decision makers and who know the street and guide decision making. So this guy comes to pay his condolences and sees there's a project and wonders why the hell no one has told him about the project. And so he quickly calls in a few of the men who don't live in the neighborhood, but that he has authority over. And they threaten the workers who are Syrian refugees with deportation. We will send you. What are you doing here? He inquires into the nature of the contractor, finds out that the contractor, who of course was hired through my university in a blind bid, was not from the neighborhood. And you can't be politically savvy in these things with the university. So he basically depicts the contractor as being an outsider. This is a very Christian neighborhood. And so for him, this was a Muslim contractor. And so suddenly the American University of Beirut, which was historically a Protestant mission, becomes a Muslim body. And he basically tells everyone how this project is a disaster and it doesn't work. He's not a planner. But it creates noise, the workers leave, and they ask for protection to be willing to come, and so we have to initiate mediation. And for 3-4 months, we basically worked. We had private mediations that were done in political quarters, in the municipality, and also in their offices. We had community meetings, public protests, media wars, and also all the mediation that those of you who know planning, you do, right? So I'm trained as a planner, so I built a model. I had small cars, and I would show them the turning radius of the car and how positionality and rational deliberations can take us somewhere. But it was very clear by the end of this period that the deliberations were not taking us anywhere. They were just a waste of time until they built on the street enough opposition to the project. And on the street, what was happening is that people who supported the project all the way to the end started going on TV. The same people who went on TV to say, oh, it's a great project during the courtship period, started going on TV to say that, oh my God, there's going to be street fights, tomorrow there will be knives, and it continued to escalate until it reached basically the archbishops of Beirut. And the archbishops of Beirut basically have a huge informal power because they decide on some of the appointments of public officials. And so once it reached that, one of the MPs who was the strongest opposition to the project, because this was his political territory, basically was fundraising for the Archbishop. So the Archbishop decided that the project was bad, and the Archbishops had not met after the post last. I'd like you to know they met for this project, and they kicked us out. So these are some of the plans that we signed on with the mediators, and that the minute we would leave, they would actually design something else. And these are some of the quotes from the residents that I found very telling. So this is, for example, one woman who went on the biggest TV station in Lebanon to say how there was going to be a street fight in front of her small alcohol store, and how she couldn't handle foreigners coming. She has an alcohol store, for heaven's sake, I mean, she needs clients. And then she said, you know, I know it's beneficial, but if I support you, the owner, who reports to them, is going to kick me out because I have a rent control and it's under negotiation, but I'll lose my shop. And one after the other, what we figured out is that, I'll skip all of this in the interest of time, is that basically while in public, the populist discourse that you hear everywhere, the public space is scary, there's going to be prostitution, all the refugees are going to come. This was the public parlance. In no private room did we hear this, neither from the residents, nor from state authorities, nor from the Lebanese force mediators, nor from the parliamentarians. The parliamentarians basically told the mediators who came between us and them at some point to mediate, they basically told them, this is a woman who ran a political campaign against us, she's going to run another one against us. So they saw us clearly as a political threat, as the possibility of another coalition that they actually did not want to see in the city. And that is hopeful because it politicizes planning. I want to say one last thing about this. You know, this whole informal thing about politics. And this is really something I'm constructing. I'm not 100% sure of, but I'll throw the idea for discussion. You know, this whole celebration of people sit on the corner of the street and it creates street life, and we like it because it creates a sense of a neighborhood. What we found is that every single one of those arrangements was actually protected through a network of relations, and that this is the people who actually had access to these little micro benefits. The collection of these small micro benefits is actually what created the opposition to the possibility of a larger public. So that public that we celebrate, and I don't know the extent to which this is transposable elsewhere, but that public that we celebrate as an informal sitting together, which I see the potential of and the mutual support, was very much integrated within that vertical octopus machine that's connected to the organized sectarian groups, crime groups, you can call them whatever you want, but that are also within the state. And so you can't see the neoliberal project as only a state, or represent the state as only like a state that's serving the elite, because the elites have hooked up with them tons of people in micro benefits that are meaningless really in terms of financial value, but that help them position themselves within the community, and that basically sustain and support the order of the city in the way we see it today. And it's a city where I'm a resident of the city. Maria was a resident of the very same neighborhood. So it's not like that we're coming to help someone else and we didn't understand them. It was actually us. So it's important. And so finally, the last step of this glorious story is the carton rouge. So finally, after the archbishops met, they basically declared the project really bad. And the second morning, I got a call from the city governor who asked me to come see him. And I went to see him. And he said, Mona, do you play football? Football, soccer, football, our football. And I said, no, but I watch it. I love it. And he said, well, do you know what a red card is? He said, carton rouge. And I said, yeah, I know what a carton rouge is. And he said, but you just got the carton rouge. and so that's why this is called carton rouge. And basically, you'll see that the actors negotiating basically pulled us out. There was a whole reorganization of the neighborhood. And what we try to do here is draw the relationship between public, private, and show how much they're intermingled together and the extent to which one cannot say state society, formal, informal, private actor, but one has to understand different political formations, one more aspiring than the other, where right here, right alone. And there's a lot more details to be told, including, for example, a neighborhood committee that we had helped establish when we had a municipal campaign back in 2016, and that we had actually supported and shaped in the neighborhood to help them go and make demands to the municipality, that was very quickly co-opted by the political parties once they wanted to support to stop the project. So it poses a lot of questions about progressive politics. I'll wrap up really quickly by 3 so whats so I don't end up with a story. My first so what has to do with prefigurative practice and its potential. And I think that in designing a public space, we did look at as if planning. We were trying to do, and I think I was clear in my description, as if we can plan. We aimed through the process to do this prefigurative work, tell a powerful story that makes change possible. That it was possible in a moment when anger against the post-Civil War order was highest to reclaim the space of local authorities, enact now a municipal movement's vision, no matter what modest, rather than continue to aspire for a future change that we will never get. In bringing the municipal council on board and looking to redesign a small public space, we wanted to make possible a different imaginary of the public, one in which the local state, directly with neighborhood residents and city dwellers, could work to shape a space. Ultimately, we failed in enacting this imaginary. However, the prefigurative exercise was not useless. It wasn't just failed. Instead, it allowed us to expose power, but not redistribute it. It also allowed us, and I think we continue to working on this, not only to expose power through the exercise, but also to bring with us other actors and see who is willing to stand with us. So every one of these confrontations and the fact that we act as if there is planning with other actors who are doing the same is actually consolidating a collective that is committed to moving forward with more projects. And I think this is hopeful. And we continue, so I'll skip here just to show you that we continue to work on this project, which is to turn the highway into a project. This is a slide I stole at the last minute, and this is the project designer, a friend who actually was one of the oldest residents of the neighborhood that passed away a couple of years ago, but who really signed this intervention. The second point that I want to make is the state-society duality, and I think this one is really important. I think we really need to think about the contours of the public rather than thinking about state-society, formal, informal, private, public. I think not enough has been done in planning theory, particularly, to approach the state critically. Neither the polarizing Marxist blanket that the state is owned by the elite, nor the idealized aspiration of liberal planning has been helpful. Instead, borrowing from the work of political scientists in the Middle East and in Latin America, and rereading the unfolding of the Half-Square saga, helped us very much understand the trajectory of the public and how we should think it. One of the very interesting ways is to think about the state as a Gramscian formation, captured through the double process of reproducing elite power, but also clientelistic systems. And I can talk more about this, the linkage with Chatterjee's political society. This is something that I'm totally trying to cook, so I will not say more for now, but I would welcome comments. Finally, co-production. I promised to talk about it, so I'll close with it. I think in the last couple of decades, planning has shifted the notion of co-production and participation. And there's been a lot of debates about how we position ourselves as academics and what's our place in this. And can we create more democratic knowledge? Throughout, there's been an assumption that scholars have to sit on the side of communities and make the state listen. I think these frameworks borrow on two assumptions that don't work. The first, and I did a sneak preview, is that the universities are respectable. Sadly, I think we have lost our place on the table. On the one hand, I think we've done a remarkable job at rendering ourselves useless in what we teach and how we create knowledge, sadly. And planning, particularly our discipline, has been very guilty of that. On the other hand, by also declining knowledge, we found ourselves sitting in deliberative meeting where every time we said, no, you cannot have a street that's 8 meters wide, and planners who are in the room will know why. You do it either 6.5 meters or 9 meters. We were told, so what? What do you know? What do you think? I mean, no, you don't. There are facts, there's science, and this was complete. Even things that small were dismissed, basically. And I think that this is really important because it's basically neither that, so that's the university's assumption, and the other one is the state society and our positioning next to communities against a supposed unified state. I think instead we need to be working on a more complex understanding of the public that's locally rooted and of which, and I would insist, we are a part of. If you're helping someone else, it's a joke. We are part of this world, we bear responsibility in it. So our representation of a more complex public, I think, is critical. And I think this is, for me, the main lesson I take out for co-production and participation. I spent a lot of time trying to think, I am doing co-production. Who participates with who and how? Only to find that really much of the literature is still stuck within a simple positionality of how do I position myself as a third actor, the university, etc. So I'll go back to the place of on a day like this, of the value of what a discussion like this can make when Maria, my co-author, is actually unable to communicate with me because she's doing relief work and feeling worn out, and where our city is under fire. It does feel at the edge of, as a friend of mine told me, you're going to be indecent talking about planning when this is happening in your city. I thought a lot about it, but I think that if I'm going to be modest about the role I can play, I do think that each one of us in our small positions can still make a difference and write the seeds for where we should be, so that we help our academic institutions be less complicit of the larger picture. Thank you.
Needless to say that this is a very hard act to follow. We had planned something else for response, but as you know, the world is on fire, and that kind of made us kind of rethink and made me rethink how to respond. So basically, what I'm asking is, bear with me while I'll just draw some ideas that may or may not make sense. On the one hand, I think the work of Mona has been always inspirational and has shaped many people from the so-called global south to think that we can even have a voice or a say in actually shaping urban theory and practice, right? And thinking clearly, planning otherwise. And the stellar work that the Urban Lab does is like our world-leading institution is an aspiration to learn and to, when we grow out, to be not only like Mona, but also like the Urban Lab there. You know, I think the power of also using urban data, mapping to be relevant to local politics and to be actually leveraging that on the political sphere is, you know, in many cases, is not even possible. And when I see, you know, the work here in London, in the supposed kind of center of the belly of the empire, you don't have that power. I miss my old days in the National University of Colombia, with the university that had more connection with kind of actually the state, the communities were more relevant. I feel when we are reproducing a neoliberal university, there's even a bigger gap in terms of relevance. right? And closeness of what is actually happening in the city. And so some of us find other means to actually be in touch, and it needs to be outside the university, but not because of the university. And we're captured now with this idea of impact, what is refable, what it counts as impact, who is entitled to claim impact, what are the causalities that are then used for it. And I find that deeply unsettling and problematic, because decades of engaged scholarship don't count, don't matter, because that is not flashy enough, it doesn't show numbers, it's not what is quantifiable through the lenses of what matters for the corporate university. So there's a double question, right, in terms of how we become more relevant, but at the same time, how are we dealing with the positioning of the whole enterprise of even doing research? And what are we telling to ourselves in these impossible moments about doing research? Is an ethical impossibility to be thinking that when the world is on fire, we still need to carry on and do research, right? I find that deeply, problematic and always questioning, right? I always think that at some point we were doing, projects in Havana in Cuba, in Medellin in Colombia, and in Yangon in Myanmar, in a year where we had pandemic, national strike, and a military coup. And yet you need to deliver and treat your funders and still, do and write the pieces that are supposed to be transformative and that nobody reads. So I think, I'm just upset with what we are creating and what is the position of critical engaged scholarship, for who does matter and how are we shaping it? And I think those are kind of essential questions that I grapple with every time, and with my colleagues we kind of hit our heads on the wall. But Mona's presentation made me think of many things at the same time, so it's going to be a bit of a layered response. On the one hand, how much connections Beirut and Colombia has. The same percentage of refugee or forcibly displaced population, the same percentage almost of public space, the percentage of distribution of public space in the neighborhood of Moravia, what we've been working for very long, is exactly the same as Beirut. But also this deeply unsettling relationship with the state. What does it mean? But also, what do we mean when we talk about power and politics? Who shapes that, right? What are the alliances, the coalition, the ecosystem that you need to kind of embrace, disengage, fight, align, and all at the same time, according to the moment in history where you are? And for me, it's very, present when you describe these lines and all these kind of tentacles. It always makes me think of how we encounter the non-state armed groups that are an essential component of how urban life is shaped, but also the para-state armed groups that are also working in conjunction, with the state in different levels, and how much that's, permeated and completely, even foreclose possibilities for have a more transformative urban politics. And I'm thinking in particular how, the discourse about doing, territorial peace and how peace gets kind of enacted on the ground. If you are encountering a local government that comes from the so-called far right, peace is a dirty word, and you need to maneuver and circumvent that, and how you frame how you do politics at the local level. And those things clearly cannot get away about, with the dichotomic premises that urban theory offers us. And that's why I think even thinking about the public or what participation means and its very colonial roots and how it's intertwined with the world of development and all what it takes with it, we should be actually changing the vocabulary perhaps, right? And thinking in what is the genealogy of co-production and what are these other seeds where this is coming from. And particularly in a recent work with like my colleague Barbara and kind of the DPU crowd, we did this work and this book about co-production. And something that I was very, conscious of doing is like, are we perpetuating with this idea of co-production yet the same again, but with a different brand? And I went back to the 70s and to work and see the old work of the sociologist Fals Borda and try to see participatory action research and try to think that what if we kind of go and trace different genealogies of traditions that are doing engaged kind of research that are not coming from places where there's these assumptions about how the state operates, what is the role of planning, and what are the assumptions about city making. And I have found very productive engagement of that kind of literature and practice from the 70s, because it's coming and emerging from landscapes and places that have been deeply shaped by violence, where you cannot take for granted that there's a state of peace, but rather a constant state of violence that present and intensified in different periods. So I think we need to be engaging more with kind of recalibrating our assumptions about co-production and violence, and how those things are also, need to be understood and kind of understood in tandem. Because when we're talking about co-production, we are not only addressing issues about epistemic justice, right, which is about central, but we are also need to engage with something deeper than that, and particularly in these places that are completely fractured, we need to be thinking about reparative justice. And you cannot, I'm convinced that you cannot go about thinking cities if we don't embrace a reparative approach. And that would require a different framing, conceptually, theoretically, analytically, methodologically, to engage with it. And I'm thinking now in the, in the ideas around geotrauma, right? What is kind of the repertoire that we need to engage? We cannot just bring the same yet tools that planning has produced, but also engaging with the deeply troubled humans that inhabit those places, right? That are completely broken. And it's not only about trust. What has been fractured is not only the landscape, it's not only the institution. There's some more deep wounds that carry through everyone. And I think that's why in our work we've been engaging with mapping emotions and trying to get to the intangible and trying to get to the things that are unspeakable, because there's unspeakable pain and trauma that sits and shapes spaces. And if we don't get into it, right, I think we're missing something that the traditional Western assumptions about co-production and planning and the state are not getting into. And this only comes from the experiences and the places that are kind of dealing with this deep pain. And I think just thinking seriously about the entanglement with violence and geotrauma can offer other perspectives in our kind of theoretical apparatus of how we engage with co-production, and what are the new repertoires then that we need to bring on board. I really love the idea about the seeds. I'm all about seeds and harvesting and planting and gardening, because we also need to be thinking, and I was kind of trying to think of how temporality is also a question that we need to grapple with in planning theory, right? This idea of who can afford the luxury of thinking in the future. We barely survive in the present. Right? So I think unsettling also that kind of linearity that is embedded in kind of at the core of planning and thinking, that the future is over there, is a horizon where all we are aspiring to, when we are really in a survival mode in many of these places. And the luxury of thinking about future, and that's why I think the prefigurative politics kind of works very well, because you work as if, not because it is, also needs to help us to push our understanding of the theoretical, the temporal dimension of it. And what is really, what are the expectations that we're putting on ourselves in terms of how urban change happens, and what is the agency we have on that, right? Because sometimes I feel like, are we going to be able to deal with all of this, right? What is our little seed? And are you then suggesting us as well to, embrace every, change the cities one corner at a time. And I'm really invested of, what is really that notion of impact? Impact is not about the square meters that you were able to pave or change the surface on, right? How are we thinking about that scale of impact and how that seed in reality is affecting the way in which we think about politics, but also how you are defining what future possibilities of transforming the city could be. So I always, when you are writing grants and when you are thinking about, you need funding, you always kind of overpromise. And I feel like a heavy burden when you are trying to think that the change will happen, right? So I think we need to think seriously, and I don't have any answer about what is the temporality of the politics of temporality that we actually need to factor in co-production, because otherwise we are condemned to always fail and just present failures, but I don't think it's a failure per se, right? What is that enacting us to do? What has been the position and the possibilities that has opened up, even though what we expected or set as expectation was not fulfilled. So I think, how can we set different questions in order not to beat ourselves so hard? And also be okay with thinking that critical scholarship can be done fighting for a corner, or can be done fighting for a market in a corner, or can be done fighting for this small park that, I don't know, in Moravia we were trying to actually preserve, not to be built up again, right? So I'm thinking that those big, there's big impact and big ideas of how you kind of shift the narrative and the public sphere by actually insisting in those small places. And I think there's a politics of a scale that also perhaps we need to bring more in discussion. We are thinking about co-production. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but also I love the word enmeshed, because it's just through enmeshment that you can actually make sense of these and the other diagrams you have. Right? I'm just thinking, what is the analytical capacity of thinking on this enmeshment? Because there's something also about how we think about actors and the actor mapping that we engage with, right? Who is really working only under one capacity when many people are kind of playing, right, wearing different hats, and how you think that in the longue durée of urban processes, right? So I'm just thinking, because we work with our students a lot about actor mapping, and also how you actually represent the complex politics of city making, and how can, these are part of the tools and the repertoire we have to bring and mobilize different discussions. And something that I was thinking that perhaps we should be better at is engaging with the digital stories and the news and all these kind of apparatus that is kind of shaping the post-truth, right? We are being kind of very active kind of engaging with that, and perhaps part of thinking the public or collective action also need to have a very central effort in engaging with these other actors like the media or like the digital sphere, because that is where part of the dispute is also happening, right? And it's a central element of it. So I'm thinking, how do you extend your urban design strategy to also design partly of how the digital space is shaping the possibilities or foreclosing the possibilities to provide and promote change? Not something as a byproduct that happen after, but something that needs to be kind of embedded and essential in how you kind of build and engage with the conversation. So at the end of the day, as I was obsessed, and I'm still obsessed with storytelling. My aspiration as a scholar is just to become better storyteller, because I think that is on our hands. And I think Mona is a testament of that. And every time that I listen to her, I get really inspired and very thankful to be able to respond to it. So thank you.
Thank you both. That was amazing. We have 11 minutes for questions. I don't know if this works.
Hello?
Yes, it does. Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question? We can pass the microphone. Yeah, here. Let me start with this. Why don't we collect a few and see how far we go.
Thank you, Mona. I'm very, very grateful that you were with us today. I learned a lot, and it was great to think with you. In the kind of politics you articulate, and in the kind of world in which we work, the dispute and the strongman is inevitably a part of the story, and it's never going to be not part of the story. Which makes me question whether co-production is a conversation with like-minded people, or whether we have to think much more about expanding a sense of public towards the dispute and the strongman. So that then makes me think a little bit more about this notion of a different temporality. And I was curious that your approach was so like you, but the conclusion was so formal. Concrete bollards, terrazzo strips in the ground. And I wondered if there isn't room for a language where we bring in moving stage sets so that the strongman can shift their car into one part and workers can come in one week and not be there the other week, a bit more like an experiment. I know it sounds a little bit naive, but I think we've all been in these situations again and again and again, and we end up with the same inevitable conclusion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Why don't we just take another question too? We can.
Hi, thanks, and thanks, Mona, for doing this today. It's hard to be here, but it's even harder to give the talk, so appreciate that. My name's Lucy, and I went to Beirut for the first time in January, but when I went through Mar el-Khair, somebody said that a lot of the French government funded a lot of the renovations happening. So I was also wondering if that comes under the NGO or whether there was also other states involved. And I also don't know exactly, because I am not in any way an expert, but whether that main street of Mar el-Khair, where I imagine this was going to take place, was what it was before the port explosion, as this kind of center of bars and people and all of these things. And if when you were proposing this project, some of that renovation had already been underway, where it was being proposed as almost this kind of alternative to Hamra and this new pumping of money and opening up of these sort of fancy bars and coffee shops and things, and an influx of people coming in that might not normally be from and of Mar el-Khair. And so to what extent does class play a role in some of this discussion? And this idea of the person coming in from outside of the neighborhood and loitering and whatever all these discussions were, and how did that come in? And then I was also very curious, because maybe I missed it, but what did people say when you asked them what the public was? I'm very curious. And yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Can we take one more and you can respond to that?
Hi, Professor. First of all, I'm from Cairo, Egypt, so really feel for you. I'm local for you. I just want to ask a very practical question. How do you, because I have experience working in a lab or like a similar kind of enterprise, how do you as a lab navigate this very complex set of dynamic power changes and that kind of thing? Not on the scale of a project, like as a lab, like how do you stay afloat? And is there room for this kind of work in our region, where you have the university from one side and you have funding from the other side, and then you have people who are just not, like in Cairo, for example, people, that's the last thing they think about like, urban quality of life or that kind of, or maybe they're not even aware that's a thing. So yeah, that's that. Thank you.
Next, do you want to?
Yeah.
Stand up, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Katarina, for the comments. I'll take you on several follow-ups over dinner if you have time. I think it's a big conversation. But the parallel between Colombia and Lebanon, and particularly Bogota and Beirut, I think is worth really thinking each city from the other city. So I would love something like that. for the tactic, so yeah, there is a whole approach in urban design that's tactical, where you start by doing a small intervention, very light-footed, and you work it with the residents, and gradually you negotiate before you do the bollards. It's absolutely what we should have done according to our urban design friends when we were asking what happened, why did we fail, and that's something we're trying now this summer on another intervention where we're going to actually enact the space literally with the residents. So I think that's absolutely a good idea. For the Lebanon question, Madam Khair, look, I mean, since the 2000s, Madam Khair is the bar hub of Beirut. It's been gentrified, and definitely the way they managed to basically turn people against the neighbor, against the project. Certainly the most used thing was, tomorrow there will be loud speakers on your street, there will be drunkards, but let's be real. That's not going to change anything because it's already functioning like this. Actually, the way we were doing it was trying to carve out a space for the older residents who can go down on the street. So they did use this as a technique, but as a tactic to scare people off. But it's been like this since the early 2000s, and the bars are the main way in which the neighborhood historically gentrified. So if you're interested, the work of Marike Kreinen on this is very interesting. She has several chapters. I'm happy to share them. Who is the public? We're still thinking about it. We're still analyzing. It's because one of the things you also want to know is if truly there could be a danger of gentrification, because the other project, this project is bigger. So if we really go down that route, then there is a risk of gentrification. Then really we're redoing the whole thing now on all this area. But I can tell you that people love the army. They see in the army the imaginary of a state. And then there's the right-wing populist groups. This is a very Christian neighborhood, as you know, and it's still a polarized city where political actors try to reclaim the neighborhood. And I've done a lot of work after the 2006 war in the southern suburbs of Beirut. It wasn't very different. But some of the effects of the civil war that ended in 1990 are still very strongly felt. Some people, when I said one of the questions is where does Beirut start and where does Beirut stop? Beirut starts at the ring road. Hamra is outside Beirut, but Junia is inside Beirut. So this is all the Christian territory of Lebanon. This is what you do when you don't have a reconciliation and reparative justice, and you reproduce these things. And in a lot of the work we've done in the lab, we show how these geographies are reproduced. However, when you ask on the details of everyday life, who's from the neighborhood, people don't distinguish between these things. They distinguish between who has been here for a long time. They recognize their neighbors irrespective of their religious belonging. So it is not a blanket, black and white, people are born this way. This is something which is constructed through benefit. And I think it's important to understand that, yeah. And there's a lot more about who you call, but they never call the police. They've never heard of the municipality. They don't know who the mayor is. They don't know who the city governor is, but they know who is the local head of the political party on their street. And for Cairo, Cairo had very inspiring work in before the revolution, and then during the months, the first 2 years of the revolution with Maspero and all that work. And we learned a lot from the activists in Cairo. And Cairo breaks my heart today. I recently had to give a talk, and I asked to go and come back the same day if I can. And it's because I can't handle seeing what's happening to my friends there. So my heart goes for you. This is one of the worst dictatorships that one can imagine. And we in the lab don't believe in working in other places, but we really believe in working with people in other places, and one of my big dreams is to incubate labs like ours in other cities in the region. So if you ever want to be a professor in Cairo and you want to spend a stint in the lab, we would love to support this and fundraise and do it. And that's how we think about comparative work. And we're really eager to do that with Egypt, with Palestine, with Syria, as our immediate neighborhood, and Jordan, that really needs some comparative reflection that's beyond the borders of the nation states, which seem to be collapsing anyways.
On that note, yeah, there was just so much there, and so much food for thought. So I invite everyone to go out and have some actual food as well, and we can keep thinking. But I just want to thank the Department of Sociology and City for sponsoring this wonderful talk, and thank Mona and Catalina for doing such a great job. It's so interesting, and thank all of you for coming.